My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter at 6:47 on a Tuesday evening, while I was stirring a pot of soup and half listening to the news. A photo notification, from my husband's number, showing a woman I'd never seen before, sitting in a hospital room I didn't recognize, holding a newborn baby, with a caption underneath that read, simply, "She's here. Can't wait for you to meet her, finally." I looked at that photo for exactly 4 seconds. Then I smiled, picked up my phone, and said, out loud, to no one but myself, perfect timing. My name is Renee. I'm 41 years old, and I want to tell you, up front, that I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything, or call him immediately, or do any of the things I imagine most people would picture in this exact moment. What I did instead was calmly finish making dinner, sit down, eat it, and begin, that same night, the quiet, methodical process of understanding exactly how long my husband, Marcus, had been living an entire second life, with an entire second family, that I had absolutely no knowledge of at all. This is the story of what I actually did in the 6 weeks between that photo arriving on my phone and the moment I finally sat across from Marcus and told him what I knew, and why I never once needed to raise my voice to make sure I came out of it with everything I actually needed. Marcus and I had been married for 9 years, together for 11, and for most of that time, I would have described our marriage as stable, if unremarkable in the way long marriages often settle into. He worked as a regional sales director for a medical equipment distributor, a job that had him traveling roughly 1 week out of every month to a rotating set of territories across 3 states, a travel pattern that had simply become, over the years, an accepted, unremarkable feature of our life together. I want to be honest about something that's mattered enormously to how I processed everything that followed. I am, by nature and by profession, a considerably calm, methodical person. I work as a claims analyst for an insurance company, a job that has trained me, over 15 years, to approach unexpected, alarming information with careful documentation and patient verification rather than immediate emotional reaction. I mention this not to suggest I felt nothing seeing that photo, but because I think it matters for understanding exactly why my actual response looked so different from what people often expect. Marcus's travel schedule, in hindsight, followed a pattern I'd simply never had reason to examine closely before, roughly 1 week a month, to what he described as a rotating set of territories, though I now understand, with considerable more clarity, that a specific subset of those trips, to one particular city roughly 4 hours from our own, had been happening with a consistency I'd simply absorbed as unremarkable routine rather than something worth actually mapping out on a calendar. We'd built, over 11 years together, what I genuinely believed was a solid, functional partnership. We didn't have children of our own, a choice we'd made deliberately early in our marriage, prioritizing instead our respective careers and a shared, comfortable lifestyle that included regular travel together, a well-maintained home, and a close circle of mutual friends we saw regularly. I mentioned the absence of children specifically because it would come to matter considerably once I understood the actual shape of what Marcus had been building elsewhere, in an entirely separate household I had no knowledge of at all. I want to walk through, in more detail, exactly what happened in my own mind during those specific 4 seconds I mentioned in the opening, because I think the actual mechanics of that calm matter considerably more than the calm itself. The photo notification had come through on our shared family messaging app, one Marcus and I used primarily for coordinating schedules and grocery lists, a detail that struck me, even in that first instant, as significant. This wasn't a message sent to Marcus's personal number. It had come through an app where the sender clearly believed she was messaging someone else entirely, someone she expected to see that notification and respond as an excited, present partner. I understood, within those first 4 seconds, several things simultaneously with a clarity that still surprises me looking back. First, that this wasn't a single, isolated secret, but almost certainly an entire, sustained relationship, given the specific, tender language of the caption. Second, that whoever had sent it had clearly done so believing she was messaging Marcus directly, meaning some kind of accidental cross-contact or shared device confusion had occurred on her end, not his. And third, and most importantly, that I now possessed something Marcus had no idea I had, direct, time-stamped evidence of an entire second relationship, delivered to me by pure accident, before he'd had any opportunity to control or manage how or when I eventually found out. I made the decision, within those same 4 seconds, not to respond to the message, not to confront Marcus immediately, and not to do anything at all that might alert either him or this unknown woman that the message had reached the wrong recipient. I understood, with a specific, cold clarity, that this accidental discovery had handed me an advantage I would lose entirely the moment either of them realized what had happened. That I want to spend a moment on something I've been asked, repeatedly, since sharing pieces of this story with a small number of trusted friends, why I didn't feel the immediate, visceral devastation people seem to assume is the only genuine response to a discovery like this. I don't think the answer is that I felt nothing. I felt something considerable, standing at that counter, a cold, specific shock that settled into my chest and stayed there for weeks afterward, in some form, regardless of how composed I appeared on the surface. What I've come to understand, reflecting on it since, is that my particular temperament processes shock through action and clarity rather than through immediate emotional expression. My mind, almost involuntarily, moved directly into the same methodical, evidence-gathering mode I use professionally every single day, evaluating complex, high-stakes claims where a single overlooked detail can mean the difference between a fair resolution and a genuinely unjust one. I don't think that response makes me stronger or better than someone who might have reacted with immediate tears or anger in that same moment. I simply think it's who I am, and I've learned, across this entire experience, to trust that particular instinct rather than second-guessing it simply because it didn't match some more dramatic, expected version of how this discovery was supposed to unfold. That I finished making dinner. I ate it. Marcus called that evening, as he did most evenings during his work trips, and I spoke with him in exactly the same calm, ordinary tone I always used, asking about his day, mentioning nothing at all about a hospital room or a newborn baby or a woman whose name I didn't yet know. That night, once Marcus and I had said our ordinary goodnights, I began the quiet, careful work of understanding exactly what I was actually dealing with. I saved the photo and its caption in 3 separate locations, understanding immediately that preserving this specific piece of accidental evidence, exactly as it had arrived, would matter considerably to whatever came next. I then began searching, carefully, for any identifying details in the photo itself, the hospital room's specific layout, any visible signage, anything that might help me understand where, geographically, this woman and this baby actually were. I recognized the hospital, eventually, from a small, partially visible sign in the photo's background, as a facility in the exact city Marcus traveled to most consistently, the same city I'd never previously had reason to think of as anything beyond one stop among several on his regular rotation. That recognition, more than anything else that first night, transformed this from an abstract, disorienting discovery into something considerably more concrete and traceable. I remember zooming in on that photo repeatedly, studying every visible detail with the same careful attention I bring to reviewing evidence photos in complex insurance claims, looking for anything that might help me understand more about the actual circumstances of what I was looking at. A visible wall clock told me the photo had been taken at just past 6 that evening, roughly the same time it had actually reached my own phone, suggesting whoever sent it had done so almost immediately, likely in a moment of genuine, unguarded excitement rather than any deliberate, calculated action. That detail mattered to me, in a strange way, because it confirmed my growing suspicion that this had genuinely been an accident, a moment of joy shared with the wrong recipient, rather than any deliberate attempt by anyone to reveal Marcus's secret to me. Over the following several days, working quietly during hours Marcus wasn't home, I began constructing a comprehensive, dated timeline of every trip he'd taken to that specific city over the preceding several years, cross-referencing his own calendar, credit card statements, and travel reimbursement records I had some passing access to from our shared finances. I want to describe the specific, methodical quality of this process, because I think it illustrates exactly the kind of calm, patient strength that carried me through the entire 6 weeks that followed. I wasn't simply gathering evidence in an emotional panic. I was building a case, the same careful way I build a case for any complex insurance claim at work, systematically, comprehensively, and with an eye toward exactly what kind of documentation would eventually hold up to serious scrutiny. That timeline, once complete, revealed trips to that specific city occurring with real consistency across nearly 6 years, considerably longer than I'd initially suspected, meaning whatever relationship had produced that newborn baby had likely begun well before I'd had any reason at all to suspect anything was amiss in our own marriage. I found myself, sitting with that specific number, 6 years, feeling something other than simple devastation. I felt a kind of grim, clarifying resolve, understanding that I was dealing with something considerably more established and sustained than a recent, isolated lapse in judgment. I remember sitting with that spreadsheet late one night, roughly a week into this process, counting the actual number of nights across 6 years Marcus had spent in that specific city, a number that, once totaled, came to nearly 400 nights, spread across dozens of individual trips I had, at the time, simply accepted as ordinary business travel. I sat with that specific figure for a long time, doing the uncomfortable math of understanding that Marcus had spent more than a full year of our 11-year marriage, in aggregate, physically present in a life I knew absolutely nothing about. That I found the woman's name roughly 10 days into my own quiet investigation, through a method that required more patience than sophistication, carefully searching local social media groups and community pages for that specific city, cross-referencing recent posts about newborns against the general timeframe the photo suggested. Her name was Diane. I found a public post from a close friend of hers, congratulating her on the birth of her daughter, tagging a location that matched the hospital I'd already identified, and including, in the comments, several other friends offering their own congratulations, referencing, in casual, familiar language, Diane and Marcus as an established, recognized couple within her own social circle. I sat with that discovery for a long time, understanding, with total clarity, that Marcus hadn't simply been having a secret affair. He had built an entire, socially recognized relationship, one where his own name was known and accepted among Diane's friends and family, a detail that suggested a level of genuine, sustained commitment on his part that went considerably beyond what I might have initially assumed from a single accidental photo. I made the decision, at that point, not to reach out to Diane directly, at least not yet, understanding that doing so risked alerting Marcus before I had fully assembled everything I needed. I wanted to understand the complete shape of what I was dealing with before making any move that might change the careful advantage I currently held. I want to describe the specific, strange experience of studying Diane's own social media presence over the following days, a woman whose entire public life I could now see clearly, entirely without her knowledge that I was doing so. She appeared, in every photo I found, genuinely happy, surrounded by a warm circle of friends and family who clearly, sincerely believed in her marriage to Marcus. I remember feeling, studying those photos, a complicated mixture of emotions I hadn't fully anticipated, a specific kind of empathy for a woman I understood, even then, was very likely as unknowing a victim in this situation as I was myself, layered alongside my own private grief at seeing my husband smiling in family photos I had no part of, at gatherings I never knew existed, celebrating milestones I had no idea were happening at all. That I retained an attorney roughly 2 weeks into my own investigation, a careful, experienced practitioner named Sandra Kessler who specialized in family law and, notably, had handled several prior cases involving bigamy and undisclosed secondary relationships, an unusual specialty that turned out to be exactly what my situation required. Sandra explained, in our first consultation, something I hadn't fully considered until she raised it directly, the genuine possibility that Marcus and Diane's relationship might extend beyond an undisclosed affair into an actual, legally recognized marriage or common law relationship, particularly given the established, socially recognized nature of what I'd already uncovered. She explained that if Marcus had, in fact, entered into any form of legal marriage with Diane while still legally married to me, this would constitute bigamy, a serious criminal offense in nearly every state, one that would also render his marriage to Diane legally void, while potentially exposing him to significant criminal and civil consequences. Sandra's own investigator, working carefully and discreetly over the following 2 weeks, confirmed something that reframed the entire scope of what I was dealing with. Public record search revealed that Marcus and Diane had, in fact, obtained a marriage license in that same city roughly 4 years earlier, a legally recorded marriage that had, all this time, existed entirely in parallel to his ongoing, legally valid marriage to me. I remember the specific, disorienting quality of that confirmation, sitting in Sandra's office reviewing a certified copy of a marriage license bearing Marcus's actual legal name and signature, dated 4 years earlier, for a wedding I had absolutely no memory of him ever being absent for in any way that would have suggested anything beyond an ordinary business trip. Sandra explained that the wedding itself had likely taken place during what I would have understood, at the time, as simply another routine work trip, meaning Marcus had, at some point during an ordinary week I could no longer even specifically recall, left our own home, traveled to that city, married another woman in a legally recognized ceremony, and returned home to me within what was very likely a standard, Unremarkable business trip timeframe. Behaving, upon his return, with total, practice normalcy. Sandra's investigator, a methodical former detective named Rios, spent the following several weeks assembling a comprehensive documentary record of the entire second marriage, work that Sandra explained would prove essential regardless of which specific legal path I ultimately chose to pursue. Rios's investigation confirmed that Marcus and Diane maintained a shared residence in that city, one he'd apparently described to her as his primary home during a demanding, travel-heavy consulting career, a cover story that conveniently explained his frequent, extended absences from that household in a way that mirrored, almost exactly, the cover story he'd used with me to explain his own travel to that same city. The investigation also revealed that Diane had 2 other children with Marcus, both older than the newborn whose photo had first alerted me to any of this, meaning Marcus had been actively, simultaneously building and maintaining 2 entire family units, in 2 different cities, for at least 6 years, coordinating an elaborate, sustained double life that required a level of careful, deliberate management I found genuinely difficult to fully comprehend, even holding the documented proof of it directly in my hands. I want to be honest that this discovery, more than the initial photo itself, was the moment I came closest to losing the calm composure I'd maintained throughout the entire process. Understanding that Marcus had 2 other children, a fact that existed entirely independent of whatever had happened between him and Diane romantically, introduced a layer of complexity and genuine human stakes I hadn't fully processed until I saw Rios's documentation laid out in front of me. That I remember asking Rios, during our review of his findings, whether he had any information about the 2 older children's ages and general circumstances, a question I asked less out of any strategic legal necessity and more out of a genuine, human need to understand the actual scope of the lives Marcus had been quietly building in parallel to our own. Rios told me they were 7 and 9, old enough to have real, formed relationships with their father, old enough that whatever happened next in this entire situation would land on them with a weight and complexity I found genuinely difficult to think about without my composure wavering, even briefly. I remember sitting with that specific detail for a long time after that meeting, understanding that this entire situation extended considerably beyond a betrayal against me personally, into the lives of children who had done absolutely nothing to deserve whatever disruption was about to enter their own lives. Sandra and I spent considerable time, once Rios's investigation was complete, discussing the actual strategic options available to me, a conversation that required weighing several genuinely complicated considerations simultaneously. Sandra explained that because Marcus's marriage to me predated his marriage to Diane, our marriage would almost certainly be considered the legally valid one, meaning his marriage to Diane was void under bigamy statutes from its inception. This gave me, Sandra explained, considerable legal standing and protection regarding our own shared marital assets, since Diane's marriage, however genuine it may have felt to her, carried no legal weight that could compete with my own. I made the decision, after considerable reflection, to pursue both a criminal referral regarding the bigamy itself and a comprehensive divorce proceeding addressing our own marital assets, while also asking Sandra to help me find a way to ensure Diane herself received proper, compassionate notification of the actual legal reality of her situation, understanding that she, too, was very likely an unknowing victim of Marcus's sustained deception, entitled to understand the truth of her own circumstances regardless of how everything else eventually unfolded. I want to describe the specific, deliberate calm with which I approached this entire decision-making process, because I think it's the detail that most distinguishes how I handled this from how these situations are often dramatized. I never once felt the need to rush toward confrontation or resolution. I understood, with total clarity, that the more thoroughly and carefully I built my own position before Marcus understood I knew anything at all, the stronger and more secure my own eventual outcome would be. Sandra told me something during this specific phase of our work together that I've held on to since, a piece of professional insight I found genuinely clarifying. She said that in her considerable experience handling cases involving bigamy and undisclosed secondary relationships, the clients who navigated the process most successfully, both legally and personally, were consistently the ones who resisted the urge to let the discovery itself dictate an immediate, reactive timeline. She said the specific patience I was demonstrating, 6 weeks of careful, methodical preparation before any confrontation at all, was, in her professional opinion, precisely the approach that tended to produce the strongest, most complete outcomes, both in terms of legal protection and in terms of the client's own eventual sense of having handled an impossible situation with genuine control and dignity. I confronted Marcus 6 weeks after that first photo arrived, once every piece of Sandra's plan was fully assembled, the divorce filing prepared, the criminal referral documented and ready for formal submission, Rios's complete investigative file organized and preserved. I remember the specific, deliberate calm I maintained sitting across from him at our own kitchen table, the same calm I'd maintained throughout the entire 6 weeks preceding that moment. I placed a single printed copy of the photo in front of him first, watching his face move through a familiar, predictable sequence, confusion, then a dawning, horrified recognition, then a kind of visible, physical collapse as he understood, immediately, exactly what that specific image meant. I remember choosing that specific setting deliberately, our own kitchen, the same room where the photo had first arrived on my phone 6 weeks earlier, a choice I made consciously, understanding there was a certain symmetry to confronting him in the exact place where I'd first learned the truth, even though he had no way of knowing the specific significance of that choice himself. I'd also chosen a Saturday morning specifically, wanting the clarity and calm of daylight rather than the heightened emotional register a nighttime confrontation might have introduced, a small, deliberate detail among many I'd carefully planned across those 6 weeks. I told him, in the same even, unhurried tone I'd used throughout our entire marriage, that I knew about Diane, about their marriage, about their 2 other children, and about the newborn whose photo had accidentally reached my own phone 6 weeks earlier. I watched him attempt, briefly and unconvincingly, some form of denial, an attempt that collapsed almost immediately once I described, in specific, documented detail, exactly what Rios's investigation had uncovered. He asked me, at one point, how long I'd known, visibly stunned to learn it had been 6 full weeks rather than the immediate, reactive confrontation he'd apparently braced himself for the moment he understood the photo had reached me. I told him, simply, that I'd needed that time to understand exactly what I was dealing with, and to ensure that whatever happened next would happen entirely on my own terms, rather than in the chaotic, reactive way he might have otherwise expected from me. He asked me, too, whether I had ever considered simply confronting him immediately, that first night, rather than spending 6 weeks quietly building an entire legal case against him. I told him, honestly, that the thought had crossed my mind, briefly, in those first 4 seconds standing at the kitchen counter, but that some deeper, more instinctive part of me had understood immediately that an immediate confrontation would have handed him exactly the kind of advance warning and opportunity to control the narrative that 6 weeks of careful, quiet preparation instead denied him entirely. I told him, too, that I didn't regret that choice for a single moment, regardless of how difficult those 6 weeks of maintaining ordinary, calm normalcy alongside him had actually been for me personally. That I want to describe, briefly, the specific week that followed that kitchen table confrontation, because it represented its own distinct, difficult chapter, considerably different in texture from the calm, methodical 6 weeks that preceded it. Marcus moved out within 4 days, staying temporarily with his brother while the more formal legal proceedings began to take shape. I want to be honest that this specific week tested my composure more than almost any other part of the entire ordeal, in ways I hadn't fully anticipated during the careful, controlled preparation phase. The actual, practical logistics of a marriage ending, figuring out which of us would remain in our shared home, at least temporarily, beginning the conversations with our closest friends and family about what had actually happened, carried a different, more exhausting emotional weight than the strategic, evidence-gathering work I'd been doing for the preceding 6 weeks. I remember feeling, during that specific week, a kind of delayed emotional reckoning finally catching up with me, as though the adrenaline and focus that had carried me through the investigation itself had simply run out once the confrontation was actually behind me, leaving me to process, for the first time without an active task to focus on, the full emotional weight of everything I'd actually learned. I want to address, carefully, what happened once Diane herself learned the truth of her own situation, since I think her experience matters considerably to fully understanding the scope of what Marcus had actually done. Sandra's office arranged, through appropriate legal channels, for Diane to be formally notified of the actual legal status of her marriage, a conversation Sandra handled directly rather than leaving to me, understanding that I had no genuine standing or need to communicate with Diane personally regarding the specifics of her own situation, however much sympathy I ultimately felt for her circumstances. I learned, through Sandra, that Diane's reaction to this discovery mirrored my own in one specific, notable respect. Once the initial shock passed, she, too, approached the situation with considerable composure and clarity, quickly retaining her own attorney to understand her legal options and to protect her own children's interests going forward. I found, in that detail, a strange, unexpected point of connection with a woman I had never met and likely never would, two people who had each, independently, responded to devastating discovery with the same calm, methodical resolve rather than the chaotic collapse Marcus had perhaps unconsciously assumed either of us would default to. I made the decision, roughly 2 months into the broader legal process, to write Diane a single, brief letter, delivered through our respective attorneys rather than any direct personal contact, expressing genuine sympathy for what she, too, had unknowingly experienced, and clarifying that I bore her no ill will whatsoever, understanding that whatever anger either of us carried belonged entirely with Marcus, not with each other. I never received a direct response, which I understood and respected completely, given how complicated and painful any direct contact between us would likely have been for her specifically. I simply wanted her to know, from my own perspective, that I recognized the specific, shared nature of what we'd both experienced. Even though our actual legal standing in this situation differed considerably, the criminal referral regarding Marcus's bigamy proceeded through the appropriate channels over the following several months, ultimately resulting in formal charges. A legal process Sandra explained was moving forward with unusual clarity given how thoroughly Rios's investigation had already documented every relevant detail before any formal legal proceedings even began. Marcus ultimately entered a plea agreement on the criminal charges, receiving a sentence involving probation and a formal criminal record, alongside a considerably more complicated set of civil and family law obligations extending across both households he'd been simultaneously maintaining, child support obligations to Diane's children, alongside our own divorce proceedings addressing the marital assets Marcus and I had built together over 11 years. I want to be honest that navigating the financial complexity of untangling Marcus's obligations across two entirely separate family units took considerably longer than either Sandra or I had initially anticipated, given how thoroughly intertwined his resources had become across both households. What I can say, with genuine satisfaction, is that my own position throughout this entire process remained exactly as strong and secure as Sandra's careful, methodical strategy had been designed to ensure from the very beginning. Sandra explained, during one of our final meetings on this specific matter, the actual mechanics of how courts typically approach dividing responsibility when a spouse has been simultaneously supporting two separate households, a genuinely complicated area of family law given how relatively rare bigamy cases with this level of financial entanglement actually are in practice. The court ultimately had to evaluate years of financial records establishing exactly how much of Marcus's income and assets had gone towards supporting Diane's household versus our own, a forensic accounting process that took several additional months to complete but that ultimately produced a resolution Sandra described as fair and well documented, reflecting the actual financial reality of what had happened rather than any rough, imprecise estimate that I want to describe, briefly, the specific process of telling our closest mutual friends what had actually happened, because it represented its own distinct challenge, separate from the legal and financial proceedings themselves. Several of our friends, understandably, struggled initially to fully process the scope of what I was describing, several of them asking me, more than once, to repeat specific details as though the sheer scale of Marcus's deception simply couldn't be absorbed on a first hearing. I found myself, more than once during those early conversations, having to actively resist the urge to soften or minimize what had actually happened, understanding that the full, unvarnished truth, however difficult for people to hear, was considerably more important than making the story easier for anyone else to process comfortably. One friend in particular, someone I'd known since college, told me she found my own calm composure throughout the telling almost as disorienting as the story itself, admitting she'd expected to spend our conversation comforting me through tears rather than listening to a methodical, clear-eyed account delivered with the same steady tone I might have used describing a complicated situation at work. I told her, honestly, that the calm wasn't a performance for her benefit. It was simply, genuinely, how I'd processed this entire experience from the very first 4 seconds standing at my own kitchen counter. That I don't tell this story to suggest that everyone discovering a betrayal of this magnitude should, or even could, respond with the same calm composure I happened to maintain throughout this entire process. I understand that my own professional training in careful, methodical documentation gave me a particular advantage in approaching this situation the way I did, an advantage not everyone has readily available to them in a moment of genuine crisis. What I would say, if there's something practical worth taking from my experience, is this: the instinct toward immediate, emotional reaction, however natural and understandable, is rarely the instinct that actually serves your own long-term interests best. Patience, careful documentation, and genuinely informed legal guidance gave me something considerably more valuable than any immediate confrontation could have: complete clarity about exactly what I was dealing with, and a fully secured position before Marcus ever understood the ground beneath him had already shifted entirely. I think, often, about that specific moment at my kitchen counter, phone buzzing with a photo that was never meant for me, and the strange, clarifying calm that settled over me almost instantly rather than the devastation I might have expected from myself. I've come to understand that calm not as an absence of feeling, but as the particular, hard-won result of trusting myself to handle even the worst possible discovery with exactly the same careful, methodical composure I've spent my entire career building in every other area of my life. I've also come to understand something else, in the months since everything concluded, about the specific relationship between calm and strength that I don't think gets discussed often enough. My composure throughout this entire experience wasn't the absence of pain, or some superhuman ability to simply not feel the full weight of what Marcus had done. It was, instead, a deliberate choice to let that pain exist alongside clear thinking, rather than letting it override or replace my own judgment during the exact period when clear thinking mattered most. I still feel the full weight of what happened. Some days more acutely than others, even now. What's changed is that I no longer believe feeling devastated and acting with strategic clarity are mutually exclusive experiences. I've learned, firsthand, that they can exist simultaneously, and that choosing clarity in the moments that matter most doesn't require you to have resolved or processed everything else first. If this story affected you, or if you've ever discovered something devastating and found yourself responding with a calm you didn't expect from yourself, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what I've learned about facing the worst news of my life without ever losing my own composure, every day.